Hello, everybody, and welcome to the interview today. Today we are interviewing Dr. Mark Brewin. He is the chair of the Department of Media Studies, and he has also written a book called Celebrate Democracy about Election Day. Mark, thanks for coming. And with Election Day fast approaching for us, what are some of the things you've researched that went into that book that would be relevant?
Well, I think one of the important things to think about when we think about voting in the United States, especially in the current situation, is that the United States has notoriously low rates of voting when compared to other Western nations. And in fact, our voting rates in the 21st century are quite low when we would compare them, for example, to the voting rates in this country in the 19th century.
Okay, yeah.
When it was theoretically much more difficult to get to the polls.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Huh. So what do you think, well, before we get to why this happens, why do you think it's important for us now to vote versus
So there would be a couple of different reasons about why it might be important for people to vote. I would characterize them as maybe a conservative argument and then maybe a progressive argument.
Okay.
I think the conservative argument for voting is that voting reaffirms and in some sense even produces support for our style of government. People who vote have measurably higher levels of agreement with statements like American democracy is an admirable form of government.
Right, makes sense.
And so voting produces support for our style of government.
Yeah.
The more progressive argument would be that when we look at the fact, for example, that only, and sometimes in some cases less than 50% of the population votes in an off-year election like this year.
Right, yeah.
That's not those, that the 50% that is not voting is not, there's a certain bias to that population. People who vote tend to be older, wealthier, and whiter than people who don't vote. And that means that there is a distinctive, we might say Republican or conservative tint to the voting population.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that if progressives got more increased just the voting rates,
right,
they would be more likely to win more seats than they do now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so you see the positive side of it, but why do you think that people, the 50% that don't vote, do that?
So there's a diverse set of reasons. Sometimes people don't vote because they think that politicians don't listen to people like them, which probably is true, but is also what in social sciences we would call a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, yeah.
If you don't vote, politicians are less likely to listen to you. So that would be one reason. There are some people just find it difficult to get to the polls. It takes time. Sometimes polling places are not always easy to get to. This might change if we, say, switched election day to, say, a Sunday, but we don't.
Yeah.
Tuesday is our traditional day of voting. It goes back to the beginnings of the Republic, and it's unlikely to change.
Yeah.
And then there's also the case that in some states, at least, voting is becoming more difficult. The rules on voting are becoming stricter in response to a perceived need to keep illegitimate voters away from the polls.
Yeah. I feel like recently I've heard a lot about that.
You
more
have.
than the past, right? Yeah.
Yep.
I think, relating into my experience, there's definitely a stigma being from Texas. Mostly a red state. Recently, it's it's not going to affect anything. It's a red state. It's always going to be a red state. But I don't think that's true, considering how close we were this last election to going blue, and this election too isn't that from the polls so far.
Yeah, Texas is closer now than it has been in the past.
Yeah.
But it's also important to realize that you can affect offices that have nothing to do with maybe the major offices. So
Yeah.
the senator may not, you may not affect that outcome of that race, but you could affect a down ballot race more significantly.
Right, right. And considering that, I feel like the data is suggesting nowadays it's our lowest. Do you think in the future that percentage of voting will be able to increase? Do you have any hope for that?
There's a possibility. Ironically, one of the things that bothers a lot of people, that the strong partisan feel in the country right now,
Yeah.
which I think I would agree that polarization and partisanship is definitely rising.
Yeah.
But those kinds of environments tend to produce higher turnout because people feel more strongly about the opponent, if nothing else.
Yeah, right. Kind of a catch-22 situation, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So overall, like with the past research and studies you've done, do you think that voting is something that most people should feel positively about? Like I feel like a lot of people when they vote, it's just a negative attributions. Like I'm not going to affect anything.
Yeah. So it's an interesting mathematical problem, right?
Yeah.
We know that one vote is unlikely to ever make a difference, but we also know that when groups of people decide that their vote matters, they are likely to sway an election.
Yeah.
The best example of this was 2008, when large numbers of underrepresented groups in the voting population, young people would be one example, were probably one of the major reasons that Barack Obama did so well, because that population went overwhelmingly for him in that election. Now, of course, again, one single vote didn't swing the election, but that group deciding to go to the polls did.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thanks again for coming, and thanks for talking with me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for watching, y'all.